Welcome back. Today I'll be going over Ginger Alden's book, Elvis and Ginger. We'll be going over chapters 28 and 29. Ginger says she could barely function and she rarely left the house. When she did, she'd wear a disguise. She says one morning large cranes pulled up in front of her house and she realized they were there to install the pool, and that would be done by Labor Day. Ginger says Vernon called her and invited her to his home on Dolan Street instead of Graceland. And she says she took her mom with her for support, considering that the last meeting she had with him was disastrous. When they got to his house, she could tell he was upset about something. They sat down, and she says he started talking about the day Elvis passed away. She says, quote, in a pleading voice, he asked, Ginger, do you remember seeing anyone upstairs who had no business being up there? Ginger, please try to remember. Ginger was shocked, and she wondered if Vernon thought someone might have or could have had some responsibility in Elvis's death. She shook her head and said, I was asleep, Mr. Presley. He asked, did you hear anything? And she said no. Then after a moment, he said, quote, if only I knew. Ginger says she wondered what he meant by that. And then she recounted to him everything she remembered that morning to the best of her ability. When she was done, Vernon told her that someone told him, quote, David Stanley had rushed a friend off the property that day for some unknown reason. Vernon even mentioned something about a suspicious shot that could have been given to Elvis without the drug showing up in Elvis's bloodstream. She said that sounded wild, and she wondered if Vernon was desperately looking for someone to blame in his grief. And remembering what she had witnessed that morning, she still believed Elvis's heart had just simply stopped. Vernon then said to her that he didn't realize how important Elvis was until he died. Ginger says, quote, it was an odd statement for Vernon to make, but maybe like me, he hadn't been prepared for the magnitude of the worldwide outpouring of support. She says it was obvious she and Vernon were both devastated by Elvis's sudden death, and they struggled to believe someone so young with so many plans ahead could be gone so abruptly. Vernon then said he didn't know what to do with Charlie, adding he needed Charlie like he needed a bunch of weeds in his yard. Ginger assumed this meant Charlie was still living at Graceland. Vernon went on to tell her about how he tried for quite some time to convince Elvis to fire Red and Sonny West, the bodyguards that had written the book about Elvis. Vernon told Elvis, can't you see they're hanging on for what they can get? And Elvis told him, Daddy, I see beyond that. You see their wants, I see their needs. Vernon said at that point he dropped the subject. Ginger left Vernon's house feeling uneasy. She didn't believe Elvis was intentionally harmed, but she began to wonder if someone might have accidentally given him something that contributed to his death. Ginger says the interview she gave the tabloid right after Elvis had passed was published in early September, and she was horrified to see the cover showed a picture of Elvis in his casket. She wondered who in the world could have taken that picture, and she was disgusted it was associated with her interview. She says the word sensationalism would be an understatement as far as how the interview was written. Her truth was only partially told, and she was even misquoted or quoted as saying something she never did. Ginger says she learned later that it was Elvis's cousin, she doesn't say which one, who was paid to take a picture of Elvis in his casket. Linda Thompson's interview would be published later as well. Ginger says she returned to the mausoleum with Rosemary, and standing there made them feel closer to Elvis. And her thoughts turned to spirituality, and for a moment she felt his presence around them. Ginger says she had some very strange dreams after Elvis passed, and every time she woke up, she'd forget that Elvis was gone, but then she'd remember and she'd get terribly sad again. She says in one dream, quote, Elvis was wearing a turban. He and I were inside a hotel walking down a long hall while a party was going on. People were standing in doorways, laughing and partying. Then some of them began turning to look at us in surprise, as if asking, is Elvis alive? Another dream she had, she was at a carnival with a young Elvis, and they were holding hands and running around. She says, I even dreamed that Elvis walked into his bedroom naked while I was sitting on the bed. It was after his autopsy, and he was stitched down his stomach, legs, and arms. I was frightened as he sat beside me, but Elvis said, everything is going to be all right. So I'm always interested in hearing what people dream about. I don't know why, it just fascinates me. Ginger says she had another dream where Elvis was caught in a large crowd and she tried to get to him, hoping he would recognize her, but she couldn't reach him. I wonder if it's like a flashback. Remember when she was in Hawaii and a crowd gathered around the car and she was almost left behind? One of the guards had to push her through the crowd to get into the car. Anyway, Ginger says Elvis's death brought Ginger's dad closer to the family again, and in late September, he drove them in the Lincoln Elvis had given them to Los Angeles to get away from the painful atmosphere in Memphis. Ginger, her parents, and Rosemary spent time sightseeing and relaxing. Ed Parker stayed in touch and welcomed them to his home and even took them to a Tonight Show taping. She says Ed got one of the show's aides to take Ginger and her family backstage at the Tonight Show. The aide stepped into a room and then came back out. And then Johnny Carson stepped out of the room, and it was obvious by the tissue around his collar he was in the middle of getting his makeup done. She says he smiled and winked at them and then stepped back into the room. The aide said he'd never seen Carson do that before. I wonder if the aide, told Johnny Carson in that room that the late Elvis Presley's girlfriend was there and Johnny had to take a look. Anyway, Ginger says her family also stopped by Elvis's house in Palm Springs. They were standing in front of the house when a guard drove by. He got out of the car and Ginger told him who she was. She says he kindly unlocked the front gate and said he was sorry he didn't have the key to the house so that they could go inside. Ginger says she felt Elvis smiling down on them, and it was too much of a coincidence that a guard would happen to drive by at that exact moment. Ginger says it was nice to walk around the grounds of the Palm Springs home, but it also made her melancholy, thinking of all the memories and plans she and Elvis had made to renovate the house and also to renovate Graceland, and now it would never happen. She says, quote, there was an awful finality to that realization. Ginger says she knew Elvis would want her to be happy, so she had to be strong and learn to navigate life with her heartache and, quote, leave the past behind. Ginger says she was happy to hear on October 2nd that Vernon was granted permission to move Elvis and Gladys to Graceland. They were placed in the meditation garden, and Ginger thought, Elvis has come home. On October 3rd, Ginger watched the CBS special Elvis in Concert, and although Elvis appeared heavier on camera, she felt he performed well and his voice sounded as powerful as ever. Watching it brought back all the emotions she used to feel during his shows when she hoped everything would go smoothly for him. Ginger says, quote, Elvis in Concert included film footage of Elvis introducing his father and me. Then, in the middle of Elvis singing the song Hurt, an image of my face appeared on screen beside Elvis. For a few moments, through the magic of editing, Elvis and I were connected again. She says it was emotional to see them together again, and she was glad that their relationship was acknowledged so publicly. Ginger realized that losing someone you love makes you cling to every memory of them, even as reality pulls those memories away. Determined not to let that happen, she spent her time writing down her detailed memories of Elvis, how he spoke and felt, what they experienced together, and what he shared with her and her family. She says she began to heal with support from her family and friends, and even from the condolence letters she received from Elvis fans. She says the letters brought her comfort, and she responded to every letter she could. Ginger says she turned 21 in November, and shortly after, Vernon made the decision to open up Graceland to the public. She says Vernon, not Priscilla. The day before it opened, Vernon called her and asked if she wanted to visit Elvis's grave first, which meant a lot to her. Ginger and her mom went, and as they drove through the gates of Graceland, it seemed as if nothing had changed, and she was arriving to see Elvis as she had done almost every day for 9 months. They visited Elvis and Gladys's graves in the meditation garden and read the plaques that had been written by Vernon. Ginger says standing there, she could feel, quote, an energy as if Elvis were near us. And she couldn't believe that just over a year ago, she and her sisters were first introduced to Elvis. Ginger says, quote, over the past months, I had been trying to convince myself that God must have needed Elvis in heaven more than here on earth. Whether that was true or not, I was grateful to have been able to share a part of my life and love with Elvis and to be loved by him. She says Elvis had opened her mind to new experiences and she would be eternally grateful to him for that. Ginger says her mom had been having health issues that eventually forced her to quit her job. She was given severance pay, but it didn't last long with the bills, and her sisters helped with whatever they could from their paychecks. Ginger says she was talking to Ed Parker when he told her he was going to be in a movie called The Concert, and it was going to be about a country western singer. And the producer was looking for an actress to fill a role. Would Ginger be interested? Ginger was at a time in her life where she was trying to figure out what to do next, and she figured Ed probably was thinking the same thing. She told him she'd been in only one commercial and hadn't considered acting, and that she would need some time to think about it. Ginger says just before Christmas, Sandy Miller came to her house and dropped off a Christmas present for her, a hat and a pair of gloves. She says Sandy didn't visit very long, but she appreciated the gift and apologized to Sandy for not having one for her. On Christmas Day, Ginger tried not to think about how she and Elvis were supposed to get married on that day. It was very painful, but she got through it. Ginger says in January 1978, Ed Parker called again and said they were still needing to fill the actress role in the movie he was going to be in. Ginger says she needed to get a job to help her mom, and wanting to start a new life, she didn't want to return to the dress shop. She says the producer sounded, quote, sounded nice. She doesn't say if she actually met him at this point. She said, though, he had two sons, one named Rhett and one named Elvis. Ginger says the name of the movie was changed to Living Legend, and Roy Orbison would do the soundtrack. And from what she understood, the movie was going to showcase the backstage life of a country singer, and she would even get to sing. Ginger says, quote, the script was still being written, so I read something else and got the part of a model/girlfriend to the country singer. She says the producer said he would have roles for her sisters too, and filming was to begin later that year. Ginger says on February 18th, she was served a subpoena to appear before a grand jury. Dr. Nick was being investigated to, quote, find out whether he had acted responsibly in caring for Elvis according to the codes and ethics of his profession. After all, why did a 42-year-old man die? The bottom line, Dr. Nikopoulos was being investigated for overprescribing medication to Elvis. She says this was a stark reminder of her own concerns about Elvis's sleep packets. She says she was just a young girl who looked up to the doctors, dentists, and nurses that cared for Elvis and trusted that they were acting responsibly in caring for him. Ginger says now that she's older, she has many questions about Elvis's healthcare providers. But back then, no one, including Elvis, ever raised any concerns about them or about Dr. Nick. At the courthouse, Ginger and her mom ran into the maid, Nancy Rooks, in the bathroom. And I'm gonna quote the book here. Quote, we hugged each other and she told me Aunt Delta was afraid because she had given Elvis a third packet of medication the morning he died. I was so stunned. I didn't even know how to respond. This was a major thing if it were true. Ginger says she was preoccupied with the grand jury questions that night that might be asked, so she didn't ask Nancy any questions. Ginger and her mother walked out wondering if Nancy had disclosed this information about Aunt Delta to anyone else. Maybe Vernon. Delta was his sister. Then Ginger remembered reading in the paper after Elvis died that Vernon made a statement saying his sister had only taken water and a paper up to Elvis that morning. Ginger wondered if Delta had brought up another packet while Ginger was sleeping, and if so, what was in it, and could it have been a factor in Elvis's death? Ginger says during the grand jury questioning, she wasn't asked about the third packet, and she doesn't know if, after all these years, that rumor was true. Dr. Nick was acquitted of all counts at the time, but he would eventually, years later, lose his medical license and was not allowed to practice in Tennessee. Ginger says by February, her mom, Jo, was financially strapped. Ginger says during her parents' divorce, Jo hadn't asked for any alimony from Walter on the strength of Elvis's promise to pay off the house. Now that her, quote, funds were low, Jo sought legal advice and was told she was entitled to her house being paid off a gift that Elvis promised. Ginger says, quote, as difficult as it was for her emotionally, she decided to follow the advice of an attorney and file a lawsuit against the estate for the full payment of her mortgage in an attempt to keep her home. At one point, Elvis's stepbrother David Stanley offered to help, which was very appreciated, but my mother's attorney decided that he wasn't needed. Ginger says there were people out there who felt the lawsuit was a personal attack on Elvis by Joe, which wasn't true because her family loved Elvis and wouldn't do anything to smear his memory. Ginger says she began to see news bits of people who knew Elvis who were saying Ginger was banned from Graceland, which hurt her very much. She says these people had no idea the real reason behind the lawsuit. On March 24th, Ginger was surprised to get a call from Vernon, who told her she was always welcome at Graceland. All she needed to do was give him a call and he'd let the gate guards know. She says she felt Vernon did this because he knew what Elvis had wanted to do for her and her family, regardless of the lawsuit and its outcome. On a cloudy July 10th day, Ginger and Rosemary went to visit the meditation garden at Graceland. Ginger placed a potted plant next to Elvis's grave, and just then the clouds parted a little bit and some sun shone through. She says she and Rosemary looked at each other and smiled, remembering how Elvis had raised his hands and parted the clouds in Palm Springs. Vernon drove up and got out and greeted the girls and then told them Lisa was around somewhere. Ginger thought it would be nice to see her again because it had been almost a year since the last time they saw each other. As Ginger and Rosemary walked to their car, they spotted Lisa in the distance driving her golf cart. Ginger shouted, "Hi, Lisa!" And Lisa smiled and said hi back. Rosemary asked her, "What are you doing?" And Lisa laughed and drove off. She made a circle and then stopped again. Rosemary yelled, "Come over here." And Lisa said she couldn't. And when they both asked why not, Lisa said, "I was told not to talk to anyone." Ginger thought this was strange considering their history together, but she didn't want to go knocking on doors asking for Vernon's permission to talk to Lisa. So they said goodbye and left. As they drove away, Ginger looked in the rearview mirror and saw Lisa had stopped her golf cart to watch them drive off. Ginger became sad and wished she and Lisa had gotten to know each other better. She says, quote, "I knew Elvis was watching over her. Lisa looked happy and I was glad. I hoped life would be good to her and keep her that way. This would be the last time I would ever go back to Graceland." Chapter 29. Ginger says her mother, Jo, lost her lawsuit on the grounds of promissory estoppel. Basically, there was no contract signed by Elvis that said he was going to pay off the house. Ginger was disappointed, but her attorney said he would appeal the decision. Ginger says she eagerly signed on to the film Living Legend without legal guidance or the standard protections such as script approval. The script hadn't even been completed at that point, but she was excited to pursue her own opportunity and looked forward to potentially involving her sisters in the project. She says the producer and screenwriter even interviewed her sisters to get ideas for character development. Ginger traveled to North Carolina to begin filming, and she stayed at a motel that was attached to the producer's studio complex. She walked into a wardrobe and was shocked to see a jumpsuit that was very similar to one Elvis had worn. She says, quote, "My mouth went dry. What was this? A country singer wouldn't wear this outfit. I felt terrible and then suddenly understood. The singer in the movie was going to be loosely based on Elvis. Had I known originally, I would have declined the part." She went back to her motel and cried. She couldn't back out of the movie now because she had already signed the contract. So she just hoped the main character wouldn't die in the movie. When the script was completed, she was happy that the main character would live, but she found it odd that Ed Parker wasn't in it, nor her sisters. Ginger says the movie was not a biopic of Elvis, thank goodness, but there were, quote, "too many similarities for her to ever feel comfortable with it." And she wondered if Ed Parker declined to be in the movie because of that. She would never ask him, and they eventually lost touch. Ginger believes she was taken advantage of, but she thinks the producer meant well and was simply swept up in his admiration for Elvis, and he didn't consider the film could have harmed her reputation. She stayed on good terms with him and later fulfilled her contractual commitment to appear in another movie. Ginger says not long after wrapping the film, Elvis's uncle Vester, whom she had never gotten to know, told a tabloid she was banned from Graceland. She called Vernon at home and told him about the article and asked if it was true she was banned. Vernon said, quote, "Ginger, don't believe anything unless you hear it from me. Vester, that redneck, I told him not to do that." Ginger was relieved. Ginger says Vernon was hospitalized later that year and she sent him a get well card, and Sandy sent back a nice response. In 1979, she worked in her next film called Lady Grey, where she was able to sing again. She said an up-and-coming band called Alabama were also in the movie. I love the band Alabama. They have some great songs. Ginger says Vernon was hospitalized again in the spring of 1979, and she sent him flowers and again received a nice reply from Sandy. On June 26th of that year, she and her friend Terry were on their way to Florida when she heard on the radio that Vernon passed away. He was only 63 years old. She was sad to hear this, but she found comfort in knowing Elvis was with both his parents now. In 1980, Ginger moved to New York to pursue modeling. She said she didn't name drop Elvis, but when her agent at the Ford modeling agency asked why she was getting into modeling so late, she told her about Elvis. Ginger says she found success in commercials and print booking and got to sing in a Canada Dry ginger ale commercial. Ginger says in May of 1980, a grand jury indicted Dr. Nick for overprescribing to a lot of patients. He was found guilty and his license was suspended for 3 months, and he would be on probation for 3 years. 15 years later, Tennessee would permanently revoke his license. And Ginger says she would always wonder if he could have done more to help Elvis. Ginger says her mother initially won an appeal arguing Elvis had promised financial support, and she had relied on that during the divorce. But the estate took the case to a higher court, which overturned the decision, ruling that without a formal signed agreement, Elvis's verbal promise didn't count as a legally binding gift. Ginger says she was enjoying much success in her career. Her work in New York led to agents suggesting she also audition in Los Angeles. So she shuttled back and forth from New York to Los Angeles between 1986 to 1991. She met her husband in New York City. They married in 1991 and had a son in 1994. Ginger says she left her career to focus on raising her son, taking pride in supporting him at all his sports and school activities. Devoting herself to motherhood brought her great happiness, and she has no regrets about prioritizing that time with him. She says once her son left for college, she suddenly had a lot of free time. So she chose to dedicate herself fully to writing her memoir, knowing it would require all of her energy, focus, and ability. Ginger says, quote, "I am not a writer, but I wanted to do this myself, have it be in my voice and not that of a story told to a ghostwriter. I had written down so many of my experiences after Elvis died to preserve my memory of him for myself." She says it wasn't easy to write this book, and sometimes even painful having to relive some of those memories, but she wanted her book to be as accurate as possible. Ginger says truly conveying what it was like to love and be loved by Elvis is nearly impossible. It's like trying to capture lightning in a bottle. Still, she feels a responsibility to Elvis, to herself, and to Elvis's fans to make the effort and tell the story. She says, quote, "In writing this book, I have given it my very best effort, and in life, that is all one can do. In this book, I surely did that for me and with all humility for Elvis too, as a way of honoring him and the love we shared." That's the end of the book. I've had so much fun reviewing this with you guys. I jump on every day to read comments. I truly, truly love when you guys leave comments. I love reading everyone's opinions and everyone's take on things. So thank you for joining me, and I hope you join me on my next review. See you then.